So welcome to the fifth webinar. Like I just said, we're almost near the end. We have 3 more after this. This meeting, so meeting number 5, is where you start having what I believe are the really heavy discussions. So in the meeting prep materials from last week, we are asking participants to read about best practices in providing the resources that they offer in your community. What we discovered in attempting to implement coordinated entry the first go around is that we didn't spend enough time talking about how critical it is that individual agencies examine their internal processes. As you guys all know, a system is made up of a series of parts, just like your body, for example. So if I break my arm, it's going to have severe effects on how I function, the things that I do. And so the health of your system is really dependent on the health of the individual components or the individual agencies that make up your housing crisis response system. And so you need to spend time talking about how people do what they do and whether or not they are adhering to best practices. So again, I have, let's see, you guys should be able to see. Do you not? Oh, sorry, I haven't shared it yet. So again, so these are the meeting prep materials that are in the file for the 4th meeting. These are best practices in providing resources. So everybody's going to have to read about Housing First. So Housing First is a philosophy, and it can apply to all interventions. Yesterday, Caitlin and I, so for those of you who know Caitlin, Caitlin is the Balanced Estate Programs Coordinator. She and I sat in on the National Alliance to End Homelessness webinar on, they are doing a series right now on the effectiveness of emergency shelters and the role that emergency shelters play in your housing crisis response system. And Anna, who works for NAH, made an excellent point in that Housing First, because it is a philosophy or it is an approach, can be applied in the context of emergency shelter. So therefore, we think that it is very important for everybody in your system to understand, one, what Housing First is. We found that in a lot of communities, there's a lot of resistance to Housing First because people don't understand what the concept is. Housing First is not housing only. Housing First is housing with really robust supports. It is truly the most humane way to serve people experiencing homelessness. So that's the first piece, right? Everybody in your system really needs to know it. And it needs to be something that you as a system decide that this is how we're going to be providing our resources, and that every conversation in the context of what service we provide is focusing on how can I best connect you to housing. So everybody has to read Housing First, and then what would happen is that people will go through, and if I'm a provider that provides homelessness prevention, for example, I'll read about the best practices in providing homelessness prevention. The reason why we're doing this is that in meeting number 5, you're going to be spending the bulk of the meeting discussing best practices across the different interventions. So we want to spread the information across everybody. So regardless of what intervention you provide, so if we have a provider that does rapid rehousing and another one that does permanent supportive housing and another one that does emergency shelter, we don't want them to maintain that information in their silo. We want them to share that information. So that's part of the reason why when we started doing this webinar series, I described this as a learning collaborative, right? You are all learning something and hopefully sharing that so that individually you guys become more informed about best ways to end homelessness, but also as a system you're learning. So again, today's session or today's webinar is going to be really short because truly what you're going to be doing for the majority of the meeting is you're going to be talking through all of these component types, and you're going to be facilitating a discussion. So there is a handout here so that as you're going through and having conversations, people can, right, and SO is street outreach. So in street outreach, when we're talking about street outreach, they can write down what the best practices in street outreach are. I think a really valuable discussion point or discussion to have is talking about what are the commonalities and how the different interventions, or what are the commonalities in the best practices for the different interventions, because you're going to find common threads among all of them, and then also taking time to discuss what are the differences and why are those differences there, right? That's really it. And this one I feel could be particularly contentious because you're going to be challenging people on how they provide services, and in some instances how they've been providing services for a really long time. And that's really hard. Like, I think that's why you get a lot of pushback on Housing First, because Housing First confronts this notion that we've had for a very long time that people need to graduate into housing, they need to become housing ready, and Housing First completely changes that it flips it on its head. I think that's the cliche. I'm terrible at cliches. So again, during this webinar, during this meeting, all you're going to do is you're going to review the best practices in providing the different components in a housing crisis response system. In the next meeting, there's going to be more internal analysis. So remember, I don't remember which webinar I mentioned it, but what we tried to do with the System Change Toolkit is package it really nicely in that there's like a bit of education followed by a bit of analysis. So this meeting is truly your bit of education where you guys are talking about these concepts and you're educating yourself. You're taking the time to educate yourself about best practices. I've worked in this field for 7 years now, and I know it's very hard to take the time to read all the materials that come out about the different interventions and which best practices are most effective and all that, and why they're best practices or why they're data informed. And so this is an opportunity for you to take that time to learn about it. Okay, so Michelle is asking where you said to read the Housing First stuff. So Michelle, that's in the toolkit. If you go to meeting number 4 and the follow-up folder, there's a list of things that people need to do to prep for meeting number 5. And so in the instructions here it says everyone must review the resources in the sections on Housing First and coordinated entry, and the ones that are, and this is important to mention that I didn't, the ones that have an asterisk are required, but people can read more if they want, if they're interested in it, what have you.